What's up, guys? It's time for another class breakdown for the Convergence mod. I am Couch Jockey. I am the lead dev on Convergence team, and today we'll be breaking down the STARCALLER. The STARCALLER is a class that uses pretty much exclusively physical damage for its weapons and spells, and scales primarily with intelligence alone. There is a slight inclination for the STARCALLER to use strength as a backup stat over dexterity, but that's more implied rather than explicit in that none of its spellcasting tools scale with strength. It's simply intelligence for its damage scaling into physical damage. Sort of the playstyle and strengths of the class is that it's relatively good damage. The damage is relatively high. I would say in terms of DPS, not as quite as much DPS as the Glint Sorcerer, just for comparison. But it also deals more stagger in that it wants to knock things down or pull people toward them or push them away, depending on what the attack is doing. And also it deals more posture damage, like more poise damage than the Glint Sorcerer as well. So that's sort of their backup theme or their secondary theme. Instead of just being focused on DPS, they have some utility stuff going on as well. They also have some other utility spells which focus on defense. Getting into the spells, we have the starting spell, which is Gravity Well. Uses this swift glintstone shard cast animation, whereas in vanilla it used a much slower animation where you planted the staff into the ground to summon the projectile. But we wanted to give it a more practical utility, giving it jump attacks and run attacks and all of that stuff, so that it actually had like a relatively fast option. Shatter Earth is repurposed from vanilla. This used to be a glint sorcery, and now it is a gravity sorcery. But essentially it's the same, it's just been recolored to be purple. The other thing is that we've extended the range of the AoE to be much, much bigger. We made the damage much better, and we've also added better cancel frames so that you can cancel out as soon as the second one goes off much quicker and roll to dodge. So in practical use, this spell is actually quite good. And you can see the range is quite far, the damage is quite good. Of the three AoE ranges, the first is the smallest, and then second it's a little bigger, and then the third one is the biggest, and also has the most stagger potential. Okay. Next we have Rock Burst, which functions quite a lot like Honed Bolt, if you're familiar with that incantation, but basically it's similar to Falling Star Beastjaw, in that you can cast it repeatedly, so you can spam it after the first cast, and it causes rock to burst out of the ground under the feet of the target unless you're out of range. Pretty good damage, pretty good poise damage. It's useful in certain situations, especially if you have a long window, like at the beginning of a fight, to hit something. Next is the vanilla spell Rock Sling, which is essentially unchanged, except for the damage has been edited to be more in line with the balance of the mod. So comparatively speaking, it's a little different, but the flight path, trajectory, cast time is all the same. Rock Blaster, another repurposed one from Glint, but same thing, you can hold this down if you're at melee range and essentially drill into the enemy, and then when you let go, you plant it into the ground with another AoE. Pretty decent spell, once again pretty niche. In terms of the power level of the spell, it's something that, like, might be one of those ones that needs to be tweaked over time and perhaps made a little bit better. One thing I'd like to see in terms of changes on this spell is perhaps maybe some additional poise boost when you're actually channeling it, because being at melee range, such a short range, while holding down and channeling a spell leaves you wide open to attacks. So I can definitely understand changing the spell a bit to perhaps have some more poise. Gravity Armor, this is one of the more interesting ones. Essentially what happens is you cast it and you get this aura of gravity around you. Now when this is on, you gain additional damage negation, you gain additional resistances, and you also gain additional poise, but you are slow. You can't move quickly anymore. You can still ride your horse at full speed. You can ride Torrent at full speed while this is on. So that's handy, and that's definitely kind of a cool combo if you're going to be casting from horseback. But if you're on the ground, then you're not really moving fast at all, and you also are slow rolling. But because of the poise it gains you, it kind of solves the problem I was just talking about with Rock Blaster. You have a lot of poise. So this is actually quite a combo, which is something that has one of the reasons why I did not increase the poise of spells like Rock Blaster initially was the original idea, was that gravity armor would sort of do this for you. But the downside of moving very slow and rolling very slow is it can be extremely punishing in some situations. Gravity armor, let's double check the details here. It's going to improve your physical absorption by 40%, your non-physical absorption by 10%. Also, you gain poise, and it dramatically reduces your movement speed, but it only lasts for 1 minute, right? But it is a little bit committal even then, because you cast it and now you're committed to not moving fast for 1 whole minute. So it's definitely something that could be adjusted a bit as well in the future in terms of slowing you down and all that. Next is sort of your upgrade to Gravity Well, which is Collapsing Stars. So now Collapsing Stars uses the Comet cast animation. So you have a relatively fast initial cast, and then you can also have repeat casts that are faster. Other than that, though, it's very similar to the vanilla spell. One big difference is that it actually travels a little bit further and with slightly more accuracy than the vanilla version of the spell. So it's, I'd say, slightly better in terms of reliability, but damage, once again, has been rebalanced to better suit the balance of the mod. You can see the damage is quite good, and every individual collapsing star that hits an enemy will pull them towards you. It definitely is not as powerful when you're at melee range because of how it fans out and then shoots in. If you're very, very close, then it's easier for the individual shots to miss. Next is Meteorite. So there's actually, instead of there just being 2 versions of Meteorite like there is in vanilla, we've added 3. Essentially, we've added a third into the mod, but this is still the first one, and it's basically unchanged from vanilla. So Meteorite's a really interesting spell to me because it's essentially scatter shot. It's like a shotgun, except it doesn't all shoot at once. And the point of firing the shotgun is sort of above you and facing a little bit downward. So there's some enemies, in particular, like very large or very tall enemies, where Meteorite is amazing against them because they are very tall and they're standing up near the portal, and so your chances of missing are a lot less. And the other thing is, the closer that you are, just like any shotgun style spell, you're more likely to hit them with more projectiles. So there's some situations where Meteorite is quite strong. Just one reason why I didn't feel it needed a dramatic overhaul, just in terms of how the spell works. And you can see the damage of each individual meteor is quite high, which was another reason that I didn't think it really needed a massive change. Definitely difficult to use this spell on small enemies, especially ones that aren't standing extremely close. But even then, it's okay. It's not fantastic for that, but it's okay. Next up, we have another new spell, Implosion. So this functions a lot like Wrath of Gold. So if you tap, you're going to get this effect, an AoE that pulls enemies in towards you. And then if you charge, you float, and you get a slightly bigger, more powerful AoE. So here, the damage on Implosion is quite good. It's a very fast, useful spell. Definitely something that rounds out the arsenal. And it's extremely useful if you're playing a hybrid style where you're using a weapon and spells together, because it pulls them in close. Okay, up next, we have Rock Heave. This is the larger version of Rock Burst. Animation's different. It cannot be spammed. You can't spam it over and over like a Falling Star Beast Jaw, but the AoE is huge. It is absolutely massive, the amount of area that it covers. Also, the poise damage on this is significant. You can definitely stagger things with enough casts of this. The regular version and the full charge version are virtually the same. It's just the full charge version does more damage and inflicts more poise damage. Extremely satisfying spell. Alright, next we have Distortion Field. So Distortion Field, what it does is it puts a large gravity field around it. It's a pretty slow cast, but when this is up, it does a lot of interesting effects. It lasts for 20 seconds. While you're in the area, all physical damage you deal is increased by 5%. Your casting speed is increased by 30%, and your physical absorption is increased by 10%. Enemies in the area will be knocked away, and enemy spells will be deflected away from the area. So essentially, you're creating a kill zone where you can stand and cast your spells with a lot of benefits, and also be protected from enemy spells. You're also, at least to a certain degree, protected from enemy melee attacks as well, because they're going to get knocked away when they get close. However, large enemies, they won't be knocked away. So this only really affects things that are small enough to be knocked away from it. It's not to say that it's not useful on things like bosses, because it is. That buff definitely matters. And if the boss is casting spells, for example, then they will be deflected by this. So extremely good. It's one of these moments, it's essentially like Terra Magica in that you kind of want to set it up earlier and like at the beginning of the fight and then capitalize it as the fight goes on. Recasting in the middle of the fight is like a major opportunity cost because of how slow the cast is, but not impossible to do if that is what you're trying to do. It also combos pretty well with gravity armor, because when you're using gravity armor, you're not really looking to move around very much, and you have increased poise. So once again, this sort of almost pylon style of casting where you're creating a kill zone, you're not moving much. In fact, you're not trying to close on enemies really at all, which I think caters to Gravity's playstyle pretty well because they have so many spells that pull enemies in toward it. So if your goal is to melee enemies, it still might be advisable to sort of plant your position, gravity armor, distortion field, pull an enemy into you, and then melee them down if that's your goal. You know, there's a lot of ways to play that sort of more stationary style. And that's that batch of spells. Let's look at the next. Okay. Next up is Cosmic Tunnel. So this spell's very exciting. We always have spells like this in the Convergence mods. This is teleport. So if I am standing here and cast, I will teleport a short distance forward. It is affected by momentum, just like teleports in the last mod. So if I am walking, then I will get slightly more distance from my teleport. And if I am sprinting, I will get significantly more distance from the teleport. Cosmic Tunnel is very, very good. So on previous patches of Convergence, this spell would not work very well if you were traveling downhill. But as of this coming patch, that's 1.3, because right now the version of the mod that's released is 1.2, and we're working on 1.3 right now, then all of the teleport spells will function exactly the way that they did in the Dark Souls 3 version of the mod, which is to say that they can jump over gaps. Because now if you cast them while traveling downhill, you'll simply travel forward and then fall if there is room underneath you. Whereas in previous patches of the mod, you cast them and you would essentially stop as soon as your character began the falling animation, which is no longer happening. So it's now more useful for things like skips and more interesting and optimal routing for your character. Just generally more useful when this is the case, when it doesn't care about gravity. When your character is falling, just because it's always castable. There's no situation where you're like, well, I better not use it here because it won't work. It will always work. And of course, there's tremendous risk with this because there are times in platforming or arenas that are surrounded by a cliff where if you were to use this, you could easily go flying off into space and die. So yeah, just more powerful in coming patches, but also more dangerous. Okay, here is Meteorite of Astel. So similar to normal Meteorite, it is the vanilla version. It's got essentially a arc shape of portals above your head when you cast it, and meteors come out of all of them, consuming more FP than the first Meteorite, but also potentially doing a lot more damage because there's a lot more meteors. But also no real accuracy with this spell, obviously. Still useful in some situations, in the same situations that essentially normal Meteorite would be. Next is the new upgraded version of Collapsing Stars. This is called Collapsing Nebula. So this spell works a little interesting, and for some people it's kind of counterintuitive. Basically, you're using the same animation as Collapsing Stars, but the initial projectiles don't do damage. Only the Collapsing Nebula portion deals damage. So as it shoots, it generates clouds of nebula behind it. And then when they collapse, that's when the damage happens. I think some people have a stylistic sort of critique of the spell, and that they would prefer if the initial projectiles dealt damage as well. But I found that it actually functions much better if that's not the case, because it allows for a more precast tactic, which is something that, to a certain degree, gravity kind of lacks. And precasting is useful. Precasting is the sort of thing where you cast a spell with a delay, and then you cast a spell, like maybe another spell with a delay but less of a delay, and then you cast a spell that has no delay. And by doing it in that order, you create a huge burst where everything hits the enemy at once. Collapsing Nebula allows for this sort of thing to happen with this class, which is something that they didn't really have before, whereas Glint has quite a few things that are able to do this. Everything from Glint Beam Orb to Macarian Phalanx to a whole bunch of things allow for precast and therefore burst attack strategies. And I wanted to put a little bit of it into gravity. And so Nebula was a way to do that. But more than that, Nebula is just more damage than Collapsing Stars. So in that sense, it is very useful. Although you are losing your ability to pull them in close with this spell. Instead, it's more just like constant DPS. The other thing is that each Collapsing Nebula can only hit the enemy 2 times maximum. Now, it can hit a whole bunch of enemies 2 times, but each one can only be hit 2 times per cast, and that's important. This was initially done for balance, but the amount of damage that you're getting out of those 2 hits is quite high. In the future, I might end up adjusting the spell a bit so that it can hit perhaps a total of 4 or 5 times, and then have essentially equal damage as an end result. The thing about balancing that sort of thing in this style of game is not always that easy, because for each individual hit, they are subject to defense, and the defense has 2 components. One of them is a percentage damage reduction, and another is a flat damage reduction. So if you hit them a whole bunch of times, then that flat applies every single time, and so the actual amount of damage that you have to set the spell to deal is wildly different than you might expect, just because there is a flat reduction for each hit. But that said, stylistically, it's the sort of thing that I can see in the future perhaps adding more instances of hitbox to the spell, just for it to be more pleasing visually, right? It looks like it's exploding a bunch, so maybe the enemy should be hit a bunch, right? Like that's really the only reason to do it. But in terms of damage, balance, and functionality, I think it works perfectly fine as it is now. Meteor Sling. This is essentially the upgraded version of Rock Sling. It acts exactly the same, but it uses meteor projectiles, and it does a lot more damage. It also travels a lot faster, and therefore further. This spell is very, very good. It's one of the, it's kind of like for all the people who really loved Rock Sling in the base game, these people really, we gave them this. Like, here you go, you love Rock Sling? This is Meteor Sling. It's just a stronger version of it. It's a fun one, I like it. Next is Gravity Beam. This spell is essentially the giant laser that Astel will use in his boss fight at the beginning of the fight. Shooting a beam of gravity at something. There we go. The hitbox is a little bit large on Gravity Beam, so it has potential to hit things even if it's not perfectly accurate, though usually it is quite accurate. The visual on Gravity Beam is still subject to change. It's something that I would like to see slightly edited in the future, because when the player uses this particular visual effect, it can be a little bit blinding. Whereas, of course, when Astel uses it, it doesn't matter. But when the player uses the visual, it's a little bit much in your face. And so eventually we'll probably end up editing this visual a bit down so it's not quite so bright. But it definitely gets the message across. Gravity Beam is very, very good in terms of damage, extremely good, but the cast speed's a little slow. It's on the slower side. It also does extremely high posture damage. So if you were to spam this, or you had the opportunity to spam this in a boss fight, you're likely to see poise breaks very quickly. And definitely it is a late game spell for that reason. Next, the spell that has been kind of difficult to balance for us is the upgraded version of Meteorite of Astel, which we're calling Stellar Bombardment. Stellar Bombardment is essentially, it is Meteorite of Astel, except every single meteor has homing. Every single meteor will track in on the target. This spell, as you could imagine, is extremely powerful. This is one of your like end game spells. Like you do not find this until the end. And each individual meteor does not do as much damage as a meteorite of Astel might. It doesn't do that much. However, it does enough, considering how many of them fire. It's a spell that I do want to see it be very powerful in the mod. Although on a previous patch, the spell was bugged and it was doing way too much damage. It was doing an unexpectedly high amount of damage. And so I fixed the bug and also lowered the damage a bit, in addition to fixing the bug. And even still, it might be too much. I'm thinking that in all likelihood, it will be adjusted downward again, because even still, it is really, really, really strong. Even though it eats through FP quite quickly, it doesn't really prevent a player, because there's lots of means in which you can lower FP costs, lots of ways in which you can do that it doesn't really fix the problem to make it cost more in terms of like it's just raw DPS potential. So it's the sort of thing that in terms of posture damage and in terms of regular damage, it will probably be adjusted downward a bit. But right now it is extremely, extremely powerful. Okay, and then we get to the final spell, which is Astral Alignment. So Astral Alignment is a permanent buff and is one of the legendary enchantments. While active, you become aligned with the power of the stars, reduces the cost of gravity sorceries by 35%, adds additional stamina regeneration, lowers your total absorption by 50%, and lowers all damage you deal with weapons by 30%. This is how the spell will work in the coming patch. I believe on the 1.2 patch, this is a little bit worse in terms of the downsides of the spell. But all of those are getting adjusted in 1.3, the coming patch, which is already something we've done. So basically, how do I put it? The damage aspect of gravity is extremely good already. So I did not feel the need to increase the damage of gravity sorceries with Astral Alignment. The way in which gravity suffers, or the way in which it struggles, usually has to do with FP management. Their spells usually cost quite a bit of FP. And so by essentially solving that problem for the player with one spell like this, reducing the cost of gravity sorcery, and also giving you more stamina regeneration so that you can cast more things faster, this spell, it kind of checks all the boxes. It's kind of the only thing they're sort of missing out of the playstyle. And yes, there is some downsides to solving every problem that every struggle you might have with the class. The downside is you lose absorption and you lose damage you deal with weapons. Now, most classes have 2 permanent buffs, or 2 legendary enchantments. One for the more melee-focused, and one for the more spellcasting-focused playstyles. This is obviously just the spellcasting-focused permanent buff. And so, in the future, we will probably make a more melee-focused permanent buff for this class. But this is the one that is here for now in these patches of alpha. And so, yeah, stay tuned for that eventually to perhaps see another gravity-based melee enchantment. But yeah, the spell is quite good. You can see it creates this purple cloud as you move. And the cost of your spells is significantly reduced. So as I cast like Meteorite of Astel, you can see how little FP that is costing me now. Or Stellar Bombardment, which does cost more. It gives you, obviously, 35% more channeling time. And then the stamina regeneration, I guess in order to show that I'd have to be in combat. So the stamina regeneration is very, very fast on this spell. If I let go, it comes back almost instantly. It's hard to spend all of your stamina with that on. So even though I'd say on paper the spell doesn't appear to be incredibly exciting, it's definitely one of the stronger permanent buffs, just based on its numbers. Okay, so that is all of the spells for gravity for the STARCALLER class. And next we'll move on to weapons and other stuff. In terms of weapons, the class has a whole bunch of gravity-based weapons that were from vanilla, and many of them did get attention in terms of numbers, like in terms of scaling and damage, so that they're made more in line with the balance of the mod. But we haven't made brand new gravity-based weapons yet. What we have done is we've repurposed Sword of Night and Flame to now be called Sword of the Cosmos. So this is now a gravity weapon. And it has your typical Sword of Night and Flame moveset, but it has a new stance. So instead of doing the Night and Flame stance, it now has Cosmic Stance, and when you do a stance R1, you get a beam, but it is now a gravity beam. And when you do a stance R2, you now get a very big Wing of Astal Nebula attack, which is very, very effective. So essentially, it is Sword of Night and Flame, but now just pure physical, pure gravity. Let's see. The two staves, you start with the Digger's Staff, and then you end up getting the Meteorite Staff as your tier 2. And it has better scaling, found on a Falling Star Beast in Altus Plateau, in one of the craters. And also the Rip Shield, which is found on a Merchant in Liurnia. This now increases the damage of gravity sorceries by 10%. So just by wearing it, you'll automatically get 10% more damage, which is nice. And in terms of armor sets, this is one of the classes that doesn't have too many that are tier 2 armor sets. The two are the Redmane Knight set, which is found in Fort Gale, right here. And the other is Radahn's set, General Radahn's set, which you get after defeating him and talking to the finger reader. They both are good sets, I would say, but once again, the class is sort of missing one of the sets that might support one of the playstyles, which is the pure spellcaster set. So I would say the Knight's set is more designed for someone who's going hybrid. They're casting spells and using weapons. And then Radahn's set is more designed for someone going pure melee but using gravity scaling. And so they're kind of missing the pure wizard version of the armor. We talked about the different armor versions and the different play styles that occur. You know, there's 3 per class. You've got your more caster build, your hybrid build, which uses a weapon and spells, and then you've got your more just melee build that's scaling with that spell type, but isn't really casting very many of the spells at all, maybe just using it for buffs. And we intend for all 3 of those to be supported in the mod. But right now, not every piece is quite in place yet. And so like that is a piece of the pure caster version of the gravity armor that's not quite there yet. In the same that the permanent buff or the legendary enchantment for gravity for the melee build is not quite there yet. But you can look forward to those happening in the future. So yeah, that's essentially the class. I'd say one of the biggest focal points of this class is positioning. It's a position-based class, right? You can pull enemies towards you. You can push them away from you. You can teleport, right? And oftentimes, the cost of using gravity armor and slowing yourself down or trying to stay in distortion field range is not such a big deal because you have the ability to teleport around, giving you such incredible power over your positioning or the enemy's positioning that this class can really leverage those things in its advantage. Even if its FP efficiency is not that high, it has so much utility surrounding positioning that it gives it just huge options. And that is, I think, the biggest strength and biggest focal point of the playstyle. So that's what I tried to emphasize when we were building this. And you'll probably see more spells in the future that will further lean into this angle. So, yep, that about sums it up for the STARCALLER. So thanks everyone for watching. Appreciate you. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more class breakdowns in the future. I should have more out very soon. Thanks everybody.